Well, hello everybody. It's really fabulous to be here. When I see a crowd like this on a really beautiful evening like this, I'm thinking, these people are really committed. Or they must be committed, at any rate. Really nice to see you all here. I've been doing a lot of programs for Humanities Washington over the last several years, and I want to add to what Jen said before. You know, there's a lot of budget hijinks going on right now and a lot of proposed cuts to federal funding. And one of those organizations on the chopping block, potentially, is the National Endowment for the Humanities. They support Humanities Washington through grants and other funding. And, well, Humanities Washington would be in big trouble. I wouldn't be here today if they did away with federal funding. So I don't want to get into a big soapbox thing here, but if you're the kind of person who does like to contact your legislator or write letters or send emails or what have you, this was one program I definitely would like to see supported. So if you are of the predisposition to send a note to your legislator urging them to make sure that this is not a program that's cut, I personally would really appreciate it. Okay, so much for that part of the program. Let's begin. I always like starting my programs, especially library-sponsored ones, with this picture. This is from the book 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. And when he wrote this book in the 1850s, the whole idea of life in the deep down below 100 feet in the ocean was total science fiction. His book was science fiction at the time. They believed that anything under about 100 feet was a lifeless zone. Sunlight couldn't penetrate. It was basically a dead area. There was no sea life down there. Well, of course, in the 1960s, they discovered undersea volcanoes for the first time off the Galapagos Islands. And, excuse me, there's whole fonts of life, little oases undersea, as far as a mile down. So the whole idea of life existing below that level was totally off the radar until quite recently. I also like this picture because it's showing a giant squid. And while people knew they existed for years and years, they would find pieces of them washed up on the beaches, or even during the heyday of whaling, they would find pieces of giant squid in some whales' stomachs. They actually ate these creatures down there in the dark of the deep. But they never actually saw a live one or a complete one, for that matter, until I think it was like the 1980s, when someone was able to catch some footage on a video camera way, way down in the ocean. So here's a creature that didn't exist to scientific knowledge in its entirety until quite recently. The whole idea of studying creatures that people can't really confirm their existence scientifically, that's called cryptozoology. It actually means the science of hidden animals, study of hidden animals. And there are creatures that are familiar to you, for example, the Loch Ness Monster, or Yeti, the abominable snowman, that would fall under that category. But not all of them are spectacular like that. These creatures, which are classified as cryptids, actually exist all over the world. In Mexico, for example, there's a giant cat, like a cougar, that exists in parts of Mexico where there are no other giant cats. People say they see them, but they don't have a skeleton or a good photograph to prove it exists. So that's a cryptid at this point. A lot of the cryptids of yesteryear are now like the commonplace animals of today. And for example, this one, the okapi, this is a creature that you might see in a zoo or a museum, but in the 1800s, they had heard stories about these creatures. They're giraffe-like relatives. They live in the Congo. People had not seen an actual live one or brought it back to be studied until the early 1800s. The same thing is true of the mountain gorilla. It wasn't proven to exist until 1861. So, long time. These fairly large, what we call charismatic megafauna, the big animals, that were mysteries. And of course, there are smaller animals that are being discovered practically with every expedition into the Now, on top of all this, you have creatures like this one, Higgins fur-bearing trout. Do we believe that it exists? I think it's a great postcard, but it's not an actual creature. Kind of like the jackalope. We have creatures that are there for flights of fancy or people having fun. You know, we're primates. We like to engage in monkey business and to trick people. So, of course, there's always that fine line between, does the unicorn exist? Does the jackalope exist? There are all these creatures that kind of fly into the realm of mythology as to whether they are there or not. And that's really kind of part of the motive for my writing my book. It's called the Sasquatch Seeker's Field Manual. And this was published a couple of years ago by Mountaineers Books. Now, this isn't the first book on the topic. I also wrote a book called The Field Guide to the Sasquatch. And I'm told that a lot of these books are now on display at your public library. So if you can't find an actual copy, some of them are out of print. You can certainly put in a reserve at the library. But I like to write about sort of odd aspects of science. This is one of them, The Secret World of Slugs and Snails. Life in the Very Slow Lane, I call this book. And another one that's probably made me close to being famous is this one, The Eat a Bug Cookbook. This book came out in 1998. It was revised a few years ago. It has 40 recipes for cooking with everything from little tiny termites and ants all the way up to tarantula spiders. So I guess I like to cover the sort of unique fringe science aspects of science. And of course the Sasquatch would count as a wonderful fringe topic for me to write about. Now, what exactly is the Sasquatch? Some of you know this creature by its other name, Bigfoot. Here's a nice drawing from the book. It was done by a gentleman, Richard Getling, who did the illustrations in my book. And this, keep in mind, this is a composite drawing based on a lot of eyewitness studies and reports and speculation. There's a lot of variation within those reports. Some people say this creature has reddish brown fur. Some of them say it has black fur. Some people say it has white fur or hair. How large it is and so on. When I worked on my book, I wanted to find one really good example of a description that was in print that we could all agree on. And I kind of was led to this publication, the Washington Environmental Atlas. This was published by the Army Corps of Engineers with help from the University of Washington. It's a really big, thick, black-bound folio. You can find it at the University of Washington in their special collections. And in this publication, they cover all the wildlife of the state of Washington, and there is a whole section devoted to Sasquatch. If you go online, especially if you like following sort of conspiracy theory publications online, there's a lot of arguments. See, even the government believes this thing exists. It's even in their atlas. Well, the atlas description has lots of qualifiers. They say it's alleged to be this, or it's supposedly this, or it's said to be this. So they're not really sticking their necks out too far, but at least it is included in the book. And I found that their description was really good. They say this is an ape-like creature between 8 and 12 feet tall, weighing more than 1,000 pounds, covered with long hair except for its face and hands, and has a distinct human-like form. It's agile and powerful and extremely shy, leaving minimal evidence of its presence. Good description. Now, the atlas also goes on to say, with more and more people moving into the Northwest and people having more access to the wilderness, you know, we have helicopter skiing and all sorts of get to once remote areas quite easily now. They say it's only a matter of time before people are able to lay this to rest. Is this a myth or is it a reality? I like that part of the report because when you look at the date of publication, January 1975 is when this came out. So over 40 years ago, people were saying it's only a matter of time. And I guess it's really true. How do you measure time? Glacial time? Human time? That's a long time. And in that 40 years, I don't believe we've really added that much to our understanding of what the Sasquatch is. It's interesting to me that a lot of the stories of the Sasquatch come from Native American tradition. In fact, the word Sasquatch itself is actually a word that originated with tribes in the Fraser River Valley around Harrison Hot Springs in Canada, British Columbia. Gentlemen started writing down their stories about this creature and published it in a Canadian magazine in the 1920s. And then it sort of became a household word after that. But actually, if you see tribes from all over the Northwest, they all have a story. In some cases, the creature is a woman who lives in the woods, or the wild woman of the forest, who actually catches children, puts them in a basket, takes them home and eats them. I know, sorry about that. Not only the Northwest, but pretty much all across North America, there are indigenous people who tell these stories. So even as far as Florida or Texas, you hear these stories from the natives of those areas about this creature, known by lots of different names. And it's not even just North America. This is a book by an author, Ivan T. Sanderson, and it came out shortly after all this excitement about the abominable snowman, or the Yeti from the Himalayan mountains. This is a big, thick book, about 800 pages. It's what I call a doorstop work. You can hold your door open with it. It's that thick. And this book talks about human-like creatures, or we call hominids, from all over the world. So there's sections about South America and Africa, all these places, Australia, you name it, that these creatures exist. If you look even in our own culture, we have, well, this is a Celtic image from Ireland or Scotland or the UK of a green man. He's believed to be sort of the god of the forests. You can see these images a lot in classic Irish and Scottish mythology. And even in the Bible, we have a lot of stories about a hairy man versus a refined man. You know, like Cain and Abel, or Esau and Jacob. It's sort of the way a lot of cultures, not just the Bible, but throughout the world, we seem to need sort of an unrefined human-like being to establish our own humanity. It's sort of like, you think we're bad, check out this guy over here. He's really hairy. And that seems to make a big difference in defining who we are in terms of our place in the larger animal kingdom. If you travel around a lot, I certainly do, you'll see lots of things like these little statues. These are Bigfoot statues I saw in a store in Winthrop, Washington. They're quite small, and you know what? They're made in China. I thought that was great. But yeah, really, if you look around, you'll see T-shirts, all sorts of products, candy, replica footprints. Here's a good one. This is a car air deodorizer, air freshener. I know. And my personal favorite are these garden pavers right here. Someone who is very astute pointed out to me these are mostly right feet. So, better luck next time, but I like them. So when I wrote my book, I really wanted to approach this in a way of getting people to start gathering their own evidence and bring something new into the conversation rather than a rehash of what people have been talking about since, say, the 1960s. And I started looking at things like critical thinking and the basic tenets of what counts as good science. That's, to me, the real value of my book. One of those rules in critical thinking is this one: absence of evidence is not evidence of an absence. In other words, just because we don't have physical proof doesn't mean something doesn't exist, doesn't rule it out. And when we get to the actual evidence, probably the most convincing stuff we have out there, well, this gentleman, he's actually a retired electrical engineer from Bremerton, Washington, on the Olympic Peninsula. He's holding a footprint cast that he made of a Sasquatch foot. He found it on the Olympic Peninsula while he was out hunting elk. And he told me that he used to go out hunting elk, he'd find these footprints, in really remote parts of the peninsula. It really piqued his interest, and eventually he was using elk hunting as like an excuse to go out to find these footprints. He actually told me that he stopped making these casts because he was running out of room in his basement to store them. Kind of amazing. Now, some of these casts, when you look at them, are really fakey. You know, I've seen them even in museums, and I'm like, that's not a footprint. That's just kind of somebody cut out really large feet out of plywood and stomped around in the mud. Doesn't really work. Doesn't have the flexion of the foot. In other examples, you can even see like what we call dermal ridges. That's like the fingerprints of the foot. You can actually see texturing, or that flexion of the foot that would happen from walking, of course. And they're very hard to convince yourself they're fakes. They look pretty authentic to me. The other thing we have for evidence are eyewitness testimony. And this gentleman from the peninsula has never actually seen a Sasquatch. He says he's heard them. He smelled a foul smell in some cases that he thought must have been from the Sasquatch. He hasn't seen it himself. But you know, by telling stories about his experiences, he's not trying to get on TV or sell a book or something. He's actually putting himself at some risk for being ridiculed for telling these tales. So I kind of believe in his sincerity. There are hundreds of people who have stories of close encounters with Sasquatch. In fact, usually when I give programs like this, as I will tonight, I'm going to ask people in the audience if they have experiences they'd like to share. Sometimes I'll get 4 or 5 people who have stories they want to share. It's almost like an AA meeting. I've created a safe environment for them to tell something they haven't told many people. Okay, the other critical axiom I like to use for critical thinking, extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. This means it's one thing to say, well, gee, I saw a bright light in the sky last night. It's another thing to say I saw a UFO, flying saucer. You know, that bright light could have been an airplane, could have been a satellite, could have been a shooting star, you name it. And in order to actually say you saw a flying saucer, now you better have some proof, like here's where it landed, you can see the scorch marks. Or, well, here's this little green man I found, or something that's really going to establish the veracity of your claim. It turns out that some of our best sightings turn out to be kind of wild claims. They have extraordinary claims, or they don't have the extraordinary proof to back them up. And unfortunately, when people do that, they're kind of setting back the search a little bit by accident. They're really unintentionally kind of casting more doubt on the subject itself. My personal favorite story comes from Sequim, Washington, again on the Olympic Peninsula. In the 1960s, there were 2 guys out hunting grouse. It was a foggy afternoon in autumn, and they saw something coming at them through the fog, an enormous figure. They went running back to town and told everybody they had just seen Bigfoot. So for several weeks, you can read about this in the newspapers. If you go to the library and look it up on microfiche. From that time, in the 60s, there were a couple of weeks where people are keeping their kids in at night. They weren't letting their pets out in the yard. Like the whole city of Sequim was under lockdown. And eventually the fog had lifted. People went back to that area, did a little bit of a hunt, and here's what they found. This is a tree stump that had been struck by lightning. And it looks kind of like a person. If those guys had come back and just said they saw something weird in the fog and everything would have been fine, maybe people would go out and take a look. As soon as they said it was Bigfoot, that was an extraordinary claim and this was the proof. Oops. Another one is, sometimes there's kind of subtle distinctions. Is this real or is this speculation? This is another Rick Getling's drawings. And the small jawbone in this picture is a human jawbone, just for comparative size. The large one is a creature called Gigantopithecus that scientists believe existed thousands of years ago in Southeast Asia. It was a bamboo eater like the panda. They can tell that by examining its teeth. The theory is, well, it didn't really go extinct. It crossed the land bridge into North America and has been living in our forests for all this time. Well, it's a great theory, but I have a couple of problems with that. For one thing, the proof of this is the similarity between a jawbone and a footprint. So that's kind of like saying, I can tell David Gordon because I have his car keys. You know, he obviously had 2 arms to use the steering wheel and feet long enough to reach the gas pedal. But the further complication is they don't even have that many teeth. They have dozens of these teeth. Some of them bought at markets in China, and only fragments of a jawbone. They don't even have a full jawbone. So there's a lot of wild speculation there. Probably the single biggest piece of controversial evidence, I'm sure you're going to recognize this next picture. Well, I put the 12 in there, I'm sorry. But this is, of course, the famous Bluff Creek footage. It was taken in 1967 in Northern California, a film. It's about 55 seconds long. The story is 2 guys went out on horseback to an area where there had been some reports of Sasquatch sightings. They were intent on finding Sasquatch, or Bigfoot, and they actually rounded a bend and found this creature sort of basking on a riverbank. Well, when they all, met eyes, the creature started taking off. It spooked the horses. It actually threw one of the guys, who went chasing after this creature with a 16mm film camera and was able to get that 55 seconds worth of footage before it kind of walked off into the woods. Unfortunately, this film has been viewed by lots and lots of knowledgeable people, scientists, experts in the field. It seems like the only real agreement that people are saying is, if it was a fake, if it's a guy in a gorilla suit, no one can find the zipper in the suit. So there's still a lot of controversy. Is it real? Is it not? And there's a lot of unclear aspects of this footage that make people, like myself, wonder about its truthfulness. Here's a couple of things for you. For one thing, this was a rented camera they were using, and the people who took the film were uncertain at what the speed of the film was. There were settings, and they didn't really know. So if you watch this film at 1 speed, it looks like this giant creature lumbering along through the woods. If you look at it at another speed, it's kind of like a Charlie Chaplin movie or something. It's very jerky, and obviously whomever is in that suit's having a hard time getting around. We don't have that answer yet. The other thing is, we don't have an indication of who developed the film. Supposedly the film was taken on a Saturday. It was rushed to Spokane, Washington, and developed by a lab on a Sunday, and they showed it in Seattle to the press on a Monday. People are saying, well, in 1967, the idea of finding a lab that was actually open and in business on a Sunday is pretty doubtful in a town like Spokane. And they don't really have any of the evidence about where the film was developed. Even the person who carried the film says he can't exactly remember. Sounds fishy to me. You know, if you run a film, you have a leader. And the leader is that film that goes 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, and so on. And right after that, there's a series of numbers that flashes by. Those numbers are actually a code for the date it was developed and the laboratory that developed it. Well, unfortunately, we don't have that leader to verify where that was. The last thing is we don't have any of the other film at all. The outtakes, as it were. You'd think if you were going out on a big trip like this and you rented a camera, wouldn't you have pictures of, here's me and my pal getting on our horses and heading off on this expedition? None of that footage exists, just at 55 seconds. So while the footage is being analyzed like crazy and continues to be, if you go online you'll find all sorts of enhanced versions of it. We still can't really say anything definitive about its veracity. Okay. Another large part of my book that I really want to talk about tonight is this concept of citizen science. Don't feel bad if you don't know what that means, because it's a term that's probably 20 or 30 years old at the best. It's a recent term, and I'll show you a definition. Best I could put together. Okay. It's getting people who are trained to collect accurate information about nature and the environment. Now, those people don't have to be scientists. Anyone in this room could do that if they're trained on how to collect the information. And then the information is later analyzed, shared and analyzed by experts in the field. So it could be given over to someone who's a primatologist or a human physiologist or you name it to look at that data. In other words, the people who are gathering the data don't have to be the scientists, but they do have to know that they're all using the same methods and standards, feet rather than inches or rather than centimeters or what have you. They want to be consistent. There are a lot of citizen scientists we're all familiar with. This is Charles Darwin. He was not a trained naturalist. In fact, in his day, no one was a professional scientist. It was sort of what they did in their off hours. Everyone else had day jobs. And we're even talking about some really great people like Isaac Newton, for example. They all had day jobs. Darwin was lucky. He married a rich woman, and he could spend 8 years studying barnacles, which is something he did, or earthworms, or evolution, without worrying about who's paying the bills. Another great citizen scientist, certainly one of my heroes, is Jane Goodall. And Jane Goodall, when she started doing her research on chimpanzees in Africa, did not have a college degree in her field of study. It was much later on that people encouraged her, no, you really need to go and take some of these classes in London, where she lived at the time, before you go back out. So these are citizen scientists who've made a great name for them, great names for themselves. A lot of the citizen science is done through universities or various wildlife resource agencies, and Cornell Lab of Ornithology, that's Cornell University's bird research department, has a very big program of citizen science. They're finding that by recruiting lots and lots of people to gather data, they're not running up enormous bills by paying trained naturalists to go out and do this in the field. They have, if you go to their website, they have a lot of different projects, and some of them are quite simple, just like, for example, observing the activity in your bird feeder in your backyard. If you do it the same time every day, and you take the right notes and are a little specific about what you're seeing, if thousands of people are doing that, they get whole ideas of how trends are across the whole nation in terms of bird populations. You know, last year was great for sparrows, but terrible for songbirds, things like that. The one at the University of Washington I really like a lot is called COAST, and they take citizens out, they train them, and then they send them out to walk the outer beaches, the ocean beaches of Washington, and they're looking for dead seabirds. If they find these birds, they know what to observe, they know how to identify the bird, they know things to look for, and that's a way of learning a lot about what's going on far from shore. There might be what they call a harmful algae bloom, you know, there might be poisonous algae, we call that a red tide. The fish are eating the algae, then the birds are eating the fish, they're getting poisoned and dying. They can tell if certain kinds of birds are washing up, that might be a likely story. If it's more of all different kinds of birds, they're looking for oil-fouled birds, and they might be finding the evidence of a very small oil spill that might go overlooked by the Coast Guard or by aerial surveillance. All sorts of stuff. A lot of these people now are looking at sea stars. And some of you from the San Juan certainly would know this. They're having a lot of problems with sea stars dying. They can't really explain why. They think it's a disease. They're calling it sea star wasting disease. That's hard to say. And they actually are training people to go out and observe. They take a form like this. They can fill in the date, what the weather was like, what the conditions of the beach were. And at the very bottom, you can see there are boxes for 3 different kinds of sea stars and checklists for are they healthy, are they sick, are they dead. They get this information back in large forms to areas that aren't getting a lot of visitors. And that's really helping scientists get a better clue of what are the environmental conditions that are tied to this phenomenon. And nobody really wants to hear this, but to be a good citizen scientist with the Sasquatch means taking really good notes. A lot of what we know about the Northwest comes from journals, Lewis and Clark, for example, of people who were here early on European explorers, people who were here before Europeans really got their hands on the environment and changed it a lot. And they were copious note takers. You can read the journals of Lewis and Clark and some of these other naturalists and really get a great picture of what the wilderness was like then and how it's changed now. It's because they took good notes. I'll be the first to admit, you're not going to necessarily jump for your notebook when you come in contact with an 8 to 10 foot tall creature covered with hair. That's not going to be your first impulse. But shortly after, the more you can jot down what the weather was like, what other birds or things like that you might have heard, did you notice a smell, was it preceded by sounds? All that information can be really valuable, especially if lots and lots of people are taking those kinds of notes. There's a whole group of people out there, I call them the I seen ems, because that's kind of all they can say to me is, I seen them. They can't tell me what the weather is like, was there anything unusual going on in the surroundings and so on, but except they definitely have a story to share, oftentimes very much later after the fact. It might even be a childhood story. So taking good notes is a big help, and sharing those. The other thing, if you watch those crime scene shows on TV, CSI kind of shows, they're always taking really good care of the evidence. And there's called chain of custody for evidence. You need to account for where it's been all this time. There's sometimes the great switcheroos. Someone puts forth evidence and then swaps it out with something that, well, gee, that wasn't what I really showed you. This is obviously a fake. So having a chain that establishes where all this evidence went. Those of you who are able to read the small print on this one, you can see that this is an apple core. It was found with unusually large tooth marks in it. The person who found it in Oregon preserved it in what was handy, Jack Daniels. And then later they took that and they gave it to a lab and they replaced it with a more standard preservative, ethanol. If you flipped over this tag, you'd probably see, and then the lab gave it to so-and-so for examination, who looked at it here, and it's now in the collection of some university or on the shelves somewhere. That chain of evidence is really valuable. When I wrote my first book in 1992, I talked to a lot of Sasquatch experts, and they would say, well, we have hair samples, and I'd go, well, what happened to them? And they say, we gave them to a lab for analysis. And I'd say, and they'd say, well, we never heard back from the lab. That's kind of sloppy science, wouldn't you think? And then I'd say, well, you must have more hair. And they'd, no, we used it all up. So there goes your chain of custody shot right there. And all that discovery and anything people might have gleaned from it was lost. The other thing I tell people in this book is to go out in groups. I mean, the idea of going out by yourself sounds romantic and exciting, but the more people that are out there, the more likelihood you'll have more eyes and ears out there, the more likelihood you'll see something. But also there are lots of different tasks you might want to divvy up. Someone might be the note taker, like in this drawing here. Someone else might be the photographer or the audio recorder, or things like that. If it's a longer trip, someone might just be in charge of provisions, making sure there's food at the end of a day of search. There is not much evidence that human presence is going to scare away a Sasquatch. Most of those sightings are kind of chance encounters, but there's also some thought that the Sasquatches, especially young ones, are as curious about us as we are about them. So the idea of having a bunch of you spread out, you're increasing the field of data gathering. And if lots of you are out, you know, if you made this into a regular thing on weekends, we'd really start finding more evidence, I'm convinced. Probably, like I said earlier, the footprints are probably one of the greatest forms of evidence we have. People seem to find them not just in areas where you would expect remote wilderness areas, but even in housing developments and things like that. They found footprints of a family of Sasquatches in Bellevue, Washington. A subdivision was being put in. All over the place. Well, it's not necessary to make those casts. They make great souvenirs, but nowadays, with our computer programs and all, if you take enough photographs of a footprint from different angles, you can kind of piece that together with a computer program, and even if you wanted to, print it out in a 3D printer. So getting good documentation there, lots of photos is the trick. The other thing is, it's important not to take just a footprint, but as many as you can. We can tell an awful lot, well, they can tell an awful lot, the experts that is, by seeing the stride, that would be a left foot and a right foot, the width of the footprints. These are all things, I was amazed when I worked on my book. I read a book by a professional tracker. He was actually employed searching for illegal aliens who came in from Mexico into Arizona. That was his job. And he could actually tell, this guy is starting to run out of water by looking at the footprints. You know, his foot was starting to drag, basically. So the amount of detail they can get, including size, weight, things like that, it's really important and can really be told by getting a series of footprints, not just a single footprint. When I sold this book to Mountaineers Books, you know, they publish a lot of outdoors guides and hiking guides and things like that. So it was a little bit of a stretch for them to be considering doing a book about Sasquatch and citizen science. But I was able to tell them that even if you go out into the woods and you don't see anything remotely like a Sasquatch, you see, for example, you might find things like plants that people didn't know still existed in your part of the forest. You might see birds people also didn't know were around. You might see, well, in western Washington, you might see unusual species of slugs and snails, one of my favorite subjects. All sorts of stuff. The point is, when you go out with the right equipment, your senses will be more finely attuned. You'll be more receptive. I'm a remarkably slow hiker, aside from the fact that I'm lazy. I like to look at everything. I frustrate my fellow hiking companions, who I kind of jokingly call summit hikers. They want to get to wherever they're going as quickly as possible. And I'm walking along looking at, wow, check out this moss here. This is really interesting. So it's really a great thing to go out into the woods with a sense of purpose and the right gear to prove what you see. Nowadays, it's not even that difficult. A smartphone, assuming you have enough battery life, can get all GPS coordinates, it can take photographs, it can make audio recordings, all sorts of things where you used to have to bring a whole, duffel bag's worth of equipment, and it's all on your phone. So that was my point. I said to the mountaineers, you'll all get more out of your trips into the wilderness if you're well equipped and if you're in the right mindset. We'll learn all sorts of stuff, whether it's about Sasquatch or something else. And that's my final message to you all, is spend more time in the outdoors, of course, but also spend more time being observant. Learn to be better observers, not just rush through because you want to get to the end of the trail. That's probably my final and, I would say, most important message. And again, I want to thank the library for bringing me out here, Friends of the Library, and Humanities Washington. Thank you all very much.